The capacity to make things rise. The Ninth Cup, 28th of October, 2010. There was a small artificial lake where Jacqueline and I met in the Auburn Botanic Gardens. Over 2 cups of Nunchai, we began to speak of the loss of life in Kashmir during the summer of 2010. Jacqueline had seen a picture of some Kashmiri bread on an invitation card, so she'd bought something she hoped might be similar from a place called the Iraqi Kebab Association. It was lighter and fluffier than the breads in Kashmir, but it still soaked up the Nunchai and tasted fantastic. Something compelled Jacqueline to recall the first time she met an old aunt in Italy. Having grown up in Australia, Jacqueline didn't speak much Italian, and her aunt didn't speak much English. Their conversation was limited, but the warmth of being family made up for the disjointed communication. Not knowing that Jacqueline was in fact a vegetarian, this aunt had lovingly prepared a meal of veal and potatoes. Jacqueline couldn't refuse, and she still remembers it as one of the most beautiful meals of her life. I first visited Kashmir as an intern with an NGO working in human rights and alternative education. We travelled from one home to another, documenting human rights violations and deaths that had occurred during the conflict of the last 20 years. We met with families who had lost those they loved. We gathered information on a piece of paper, and we wrote about who had died, when they died, how they died, what age they were when they died, their monthly income before they died, whether they had been married before they died, and how many children were left behind after they died. Inside one home, we were given tea with cookies and cake, while an elderly mother wailed for her dead son. 15 years after his death, her pain felt fresh. In Kashmir, it often feels as though everyone has lost someone. Jacqueline and I spoke of bicarb soda's role in the preparation of Nunchai. I explained how it helped to turn the tea pink, but that each family had their own specific ways of putting it to use. Jacqueline started imagining family stories and how they shaped each household's distinct Nunchai habits. My father used to have something or other, so he always had his Nunchai with this or that. Jacqueline was interested in Ful's ability to change things. It changed the colour of tea, it made some things fizz and bubble, it made others rise, and it also cleaned. The substance provides a metaphor that resonates well with the situation in Kashmir today. Ful is central to almost every kitchen in Kashmir. It is a fine white powder that has the capacity to make things rise. Kashmir's Land and Azadi, the 20th Cup, 29th of November 2010. A 17-year-old boy named Tariq Ahmed Dar died in police custody on the 25th of July. This is the 20th Cup of Nunchai. Tariq was the 20th person to be killed in the conflict in Kashmir during the summer months of 2010, but he was the 32nd person to die since January. Thornton and I sat in silence. 17 is very young. Thornton looked dismayed. At that age, one's life hasn't really just begun. No, actually, at 17, your life hasn't even started. Was the young man Muslim? Thornton and I discussed the religious makeup of Kashmir, historically over time and geographically across space. Thornton was a self-taught student of Marxism, and he thought that Kashmir's story must be more complicated than matters of religion alone. He was particularly interested to learn of the class politics, the feudal dynamics of land ownership, and the rule of a Hindu king over a Muslim majority population. Thornton was surprised to learn that the death of young men like Tariq Ahmed Dar took place far from a border. The summer of 2010 was not so much about borders between India and Pakistan, but about Kashmiri civilians and the Indian state. We spoke of the protests, the stone throwing, and the waves of violence that build up and then subside. But Thornton wanted to know more about the quality of life in Kashmir. He held the ideal of egalitarianism close to heart, and the land reforms, revolutionary in nature, that took place in Kashmir shortly after partition, interested him greatly. I was surprised to learn that while it is estimated that 28.3% of people in India live below the poverty line, in Jammu and Kashmir, that number lies at only 4.5%. Harsh Mandir holds the land reforms that took place in Kashmir during the first decade after partition responsible for these low levels of poverty. In an article titled Hunger in the Valley, he describes Kashmir as among the most egalitarian societies in South Asia today. But, he argues, the lack of good local governance in Kashmir over the last 2 decades of conflict has meant that, quote, the small battles of people's everyday survival have been overlooked. Mandir lambasts the state for lack of good governance. He does not cite the endemic violence of the state in Kashmir, though, but rather the neglect of employment and agricultural growth, which has, according to Mandir, led teenage children driven to despair and anger to throw stones at policemen in Kashmir. This development plank is often employed to make sense of Kashmir's grievances with the Indian state, and has been used to confuse the narrative of Azadi within and outside Kashmir for some time now. Many Kashmiris say the main reason they have been able to sustain their struggle for so long against a much larger and stronger Indian state is because the land reforms provided a vast majority with the means to grow their own food, providing the everyday household with a modicum of economic independence and security. This was true for the summer of 2010, as much as for the decades that preceded it. During curfews that could last weeks or months at a time, the household garden and kitchen stores are key to survival. Pointing to a huge drum of rice in a domestic kitchen, one friend in Kupwara told me with a cheeky, proud smile, "You never know what will happen in Kashmir, so we keep our food stores as large as we can afford." Many Kashmiris believe that India's military occupation has orchestrated a long-running policy to make Kashmiris dependent on state doles and to gradually erode the egalitarian agrarian setup in order to weaken the struggle for Azadi. In light of all this, one needs to take the arguments made by ostensibly well-meaning Indians like Mandir with a pinch of salt. Why would a state that has misled, tortured, and killed people for decades with one hand make decisions that would actually benefit quality of life with the other? How does one begin to discuss good governance without addressing people's collective right to decide how they want to be governed? Still, the core of Mandir's argument holds true. While the big political battles play out in Kashmir, we cannot forget the small battles of everyday life. But this "we" is not the Indian state, as he would like us to believe, but Kashmiris themselves, and everyone who genuinely supports the right of people to live their lives according to their own will. Kashmir's enduring weapon, the 115th and 116th cups of Nunchai, 29th of July 2012. On a hot afternoon during Ramadan, Majid and I met with Shaukat at his home in Srinagar. There is nothing light-hearted about what you are doing. It makes complete sense, in the same way that our Fatiha Chai does. Shaukat was welcoming. He went on to explain to me that Fatiha Chai is a Kashmiri tradition that takes place at the end of a period of mourning. When a person dies, it is the neighbour's responsibility to feed the mourning family for 3 days. In reciprocity, on the 4th day, The mourning family served the neighbours nunchai as a way to mark the end of their mourning. This is Fateh chai. But as Kashmiri culture has become more Islamicized, this tradition of ours has started to wane, Shaukat said. He had taught international law and human rights at the University of Kashmir for many years, and Majid was a young journalist from Srinagar. Both agreed that it was the strength of familial bonds in Kashmir that enabled the movement's continuing resilience. If it were not for our ability to share and to take care of each other, how else would a society survive what Kashmir has? Shaukat reasoned. He handed me a document in Urdu. I'm sorry, I know you can't read it, but it's important that non-English speaking people in Kashmir are able to access this kind of information. This is a document my student has been preparing for quite some time. It is a list of everyone who died here in 2010. And how they died. He handed me another book in English. You can read this one. It's also about the summer of 2010. But keep in mind, it was produced by the Indian establishment, and it needs to be read in light of that. As we spoke, he pulled more and more books from the shelf, including Facets of a Resurgent Kashmir, a collection of his own writing that had been published in local newspapers between 1999 and 2008. Some years ago, a high official from the Home Ministry phoned the editor of a leading newspaper in Kashmir and gave them a list of names they did not want to see in print anymore. My name was on that list, Shaukat said. They told me it was no longer about what I wrote, but the mere presence of my name that was the problem. Shaukat pulled more papers from his bookshelf. Majid and I looked over 3 photocopied documents from the government of Jammu and Kashmir. In 2010, these documents led to the complete shutdown of local television networks. Ironically, the documents accuse local news networks of broadcasting content that has the potential of creating a breach of peace and tranquility. While on the streets, the armed forces shot at, beat, and killed unarmed and stone-throwing protesters, civilians in mourning, and civilians who were simply passing by. 2 years later, local television has still not returned to air in Kashmir, and Shaukat said he has a difficult time getting his writing published. Every absence, though, has its own kind of presence. I asked Majid and Shaukat when freedom would come. It's a geopolitical issue. It was the weakening of the British Empire after World War II which led to their withdrawal from South Asia. Kashmir needs something similar to happen, something that either weakens India or brings about international intervention, Shaukat said. I'm always waiting for the day when Kashmir's freedom appears on the cover of our newspapers, Majid said. I was in Shopian not long ago. Everyone was speaking about this 12-year-old boy, who was the bravest stone thrower around. He had lost 3 of his family in the conflict and was always seen at the head of a protest march. People started calling him Jazba, which literally translates into sentiment in English. I asked one man when he thought freedom would come, and he told me when Jazba grows up. Shaukat continued. I was once part of this panel discussion with an official from the Indian Army, and I told him and all the people in attendance, as of yet, there have been no weapons invented that are capable of killing people's sentiment. Shaukat concluded, that is still our most enduring weapon.